Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's training session. Great to have you all with us. We'll just give everyone a minute or two to join us in the session. I see lots of you coming in now, so please take a moment just to find your audio settings, etc. And we'll get started in a second. So thanks very much for being here with us today. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box if you'd like to say who you are, what organization you're joining from, etc. And we'll get started in just a moment. Thanks, everyone. Okay, I see the numbers who are joining us have slowed down slightly, so I'm sure we'll have a few more come into the session, but I think let's get started. So welcome, everyone. It's really great to have you all with us today, and thanks very much for joining today's training session. So we're here today for the first part of a two-part workshop on gender equality in capital markets. So as we start, as I said, feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box. So we've got quite a packed schedule today, and thank you very much to the Athens Exchange Group for hosting today's session. This is a really collaborative effort for this programme, developed with the IFC, with UN Women, Columbia University, and supported by the Luxembourg government as well. And of course, today's session made possible by our hosts, Athex. So without further ado, I'd firstly like to introduce the session by handing over for some welcome remarks from Lilian Georgopoulou from the Athens Exchange Group. So Lilian is the Deputy Chief Listings Officer at Athex. Thanks very much for joining us, Lilian, and I'll hand it over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Fiona, and very quick but warm welcome from me. I would like to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I do recognize that it's a big time commitment for all of you. So thank you very much for joining this, what we believe is going to be a very interesting but also very important session. This training follows another training that we hosted again with the help of SSC last year, and it's part of Athex's ongoing initiatives and efforts to raise awareness and educate the ecosystem around issues of sustainability as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think this is a very timely day that we organize this session ahead of International Women's Day in a couple of weeks' time. And also a very pertinent topic in light of the new European Women on Boards Directive that aims to promote a more balanced gender representation on the boards of listed companies. So I'm really looking forward to an enlightening and interesting session. And let me just express my sincere gratitude, and we're very honored to have these esteemed speakers. Thank you very much to the SSC, the IFC, UN Women, Columbia University, and Luxembourg. Thank you all very much for hosting this session for us today.
Great, thanks so much for that opening, Lilian. And as you say, loads of great progress happening out there that there's parallels. So good time as ever, as you say, to dive into this topic. Brilliant. So with that, I'm going to go through a few elements of housekeeping and introductions just to explain a bit more about the format of the session before we get into the content. So today's training is really looking at the interface of gender equality in global markets. And as many of you may already feel, gender equality and finance can be both a sensitive as well as a complex topic. So rather than pretending that that complexity doesn't exist, what we aim to do is to better understand it and identify means of moving forwards. So today's session looks particularly at understanding those complexities. And in our second session, we're going to get into more action-oriented mechanisms for advancing gender equality and addressing these complexities. So as you know, this is a two-part course, and our next session will take place tomorrow on Tuesday. We'll have a live facilitation for 2 hours in each session, and we'll also be using the Q&A, the chat function, and a number of interactive activities throughout. So we really encourage your active participation in the session through the polls that we're going to be doing, and also through some Menti exercises as well. So it's really beneficial, I think, for other participants to hear your perspectives. So please do continue to share those. And then the final point to mention here is that you will be eligible to receive a completion certificate for completing the 2 parts of the training program. To do that, you're going to need to fill out the feedback survey that you'll receive at the end of tomorrow's session. So it's a good motive, we hope, to keep going with training, because that certificate can also be used if you're a member of a professional body towards your continuing professional development. So as you will probably have noticed by now, all of you participants are on mute. However, we really do encourage you to use the chat function and the Q&A function to participate in the session. So please use the chat if you'd like to share any comments or discussion points with the other participants. And then please make sure that you use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen for any particular questions that you might have. And that will make sure that those questions are answered. And then just to introduce the speakers that you have facilitating today's training session. So you have myself, Fiona Quinlan-Wells from the UN SSE team, and I'm joined by my colleague Landon Wilcock, our project officer as well. And then we're also very pleased to be joined by our colleague Maya Lofstrom from UN Women, and Maya is going to be helping us in facilitating today's training too. And our final speaker for today's session will be Harry Agomba from Bloomberg. Unfortunately, Harry isn't actually able to join us in person today, but he has supported this training on a number of occasions in the past. So what we have done is recorded a version of his presentation, which we'll share with you. And then we do have a number of other live guest speakers who'll be joining us at tomorrow's speaking training as well. Great, so that was the introductions done, and then just to speak a little bit about some of the complexities that we plan to approach in today's session and how we'll be doing that. So as we've mentioned, gender equality is of course a complex topic, and it's important to see it that way because actually if you think that gender equality is a simple issue, maybe it's something you haven't actually thought about enough yet. But to guide you through that complexity, we've broken this training program down into 4 clear steps that both individuals and organizations can use as they address this complexity and consider how to enhance gender equality in their operations and processes. So part 1 today looks at those first 2 steps of preparation and alignment. And in these first 2 steps, we're focusing on what gender equality is, why it's important, and we provide an overview of the main standards and guidelines that can guide performance on this topic. And then tomorrow's part 2 session is going to dig into the action. So this is where we'll move on to those second 2 steps around implementation and communication. So as I've mentioned, here are the 4 different modules that provide you with an overview of the programme. An important note here is really that this is an ongoing process. So once you've started communicating on gender equality performance, this isn't the job done. So like many sustainability related topics, this is going to be a constant process of improvement. So whilst we're going to work through these 4 steps in the order that you see on the screen here, of course, many of you will have taken some action on aspects of this already, or may need to revisit earlier areas as well. So it's just to say that we break it down this way for training purposes, but we know, of course, that in practice, this is really a circle that needs to continue to be progressed. And so to help us work through these 4 areas, we have a number of learning objectives, which I'll share with you here. And these objectives are really around understanding why action is needed for enhancing gender equality and identifying what tools that you can use to enhance gender equality. So that's going to be the particular focus for these sessions. And so to do that, we've got a bit of an agenda that just breaks out those different steps into 2 segments. We'll be taking a short break in the middle as well, which we always find is quite helpful. As we know, concentrating online for extended periods can be quite tricky. So we will take a short break. And as I said, we'll be looking for your participation throughout as well, which we hope will help with interactivity. We'll have some time at the end for questions that we'll address from the Q&A, but please do share those questions throughout using the Q&A box, and the team will be typing responses to you as we work along through the training as well. Great, so to get us started, we've got a little bit of a warm-up exercise which we'll be going into Menti for, just to make sure everyone can access Menti first off, and also just to get a bit of your perspective on some of these issues. So Landon has just shared with you in the chat the link to access Menti, and I'm going to just share my screen with you all as well now to show you the questions. Great, so I can see some of you have already been able to access the Menti there. If you haven't already joined us using the link Landon shared, you can also navigate to menti.com, as you see at the top of the screen there, and enter the code that's showing at the top of the screen for you. But the first question that we wanted to ask you today is to share with us your current level of understanding and comfort on these topics. So let us know how confident you feel in your knowledge on gender equality in global markets, how comfortable you might be discussing these topics with other people, and how likely you might be to take action to improve gender equality in your organization. So this is helpful for us just to get a bit of a sense of where you are in your organizations today, and we'll revisit that at the end of the session as well, just to test whether we think we've been able to improve in any of those areas. Great, so I see already over 50 of you have been able to take part. That's fantastic. Would encourage everyone else to try and join us in Menti now as well, because we'll be coming back to use that more throughout the session. So please do keep that open. But we can see there that I think we kind of have, I'd say, a medium to high confidence in some of these objectives. So perhaps a little bit less confident at the moment in your knowledge of gender equality in global markets, but we're coming out a bit more strongly around discussing the topics and how to take action in your organizations. So that's fantastic to see that we have a range today, but some of you have obviously got some quite good experience already of working on these topics. So please do feel free to share that with others in the chat. If there's anything that you have that you can share about what you've been doing, I'm sure that will be very beneficial for everyone. Super. So that's really helpful just to get that sense from you all. So as I said, if you can keep Menti open in the background, we'll go back to it later. But what I will do now is I'll just take us back into the slide presentation. If you just give me 1 second. There we go. Great. So thanks all for sharing with us there. So then I'm going to start us off now by just talking a bit around our prepare section of content, diving into that topic a bit further. So as I've mentioned, prepare is our sort of starting point to really understand how gender connects to finance. And there are 3 main sections in this unit, which narrow into the topic in a bit more detail. So we'll start by looking at what the case for action is, and then we're going to narrow in a bit more to look at the market trends for this unit, and then how we're doing in terms of progress on gender equality. And then in the final section, we're going to talk about some of the terminology or language that will help us to communicate gender equality. So firstly, starting with prepare and purpose. So, why does gender equality matter to business and financial markets? So to get started, it's important to highlight that equality between genders is a human right. It's widely documented that women and girls can experience adverse impacts of business activities differently and often disproportionately. So they can also face additional barriers in seeking access to effective remedies. Moreover, because of multiple forms of discrimination, different women and girls may be differently affected by business activities, and that could depend on their age, their colour, caste, class, ethnicity, religion, language, literacy, their access to economic resources, marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, and the list, of course, goes on. And so that's a long list of aspects that can influence how someone is treated, But what's that all to say is that this is a complex and, of course, an intersecting topic with other aspects of identity and diversity. So the document that you can see on the screen at the moment is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And these are the global authoritative standards to prevent, mitigate, and remediate business-related adverse human rights impacts. So we flagged on this slide a few of those principles to help us understand the obligations that businesses have. So the first principle that we highlight here is number 14. And this indicates that the responsibility of business enterprises is to respect human rights, and that applies to all entities, regardless of their size, their sector, their operational context, ownership, and structure. And the second principle we highlight here is number 16. And this encourages businesses to express their commitment to meet their human rights responsibilities through a statement of policy that should have certain characteristics. And so you can read more about this in the document that's shown on the screen and which we have a link to that we can share. And we'll also share that in the chat. And another principle that we want to flag is number 20. And this highlights that to verify whether adverse human rights impacts are being addressed, businesses should track the effectiveness of their response by using sex disaggregated data. And this should be collected in line with a human rights-based approach and outcomes indicators developed in consultation with affected people and gender experts. So we'll be discussing this in more detail in part 2 of our communications module, but it's important to also recognise that even if this data isn't made public, it's also really important to disaggregate it so that you can make better decisions internally and identify any issues as they arise. And so the final principle that we wanted to highlight here is around the important role of communications. So according to this principle, businesses should be prepared to communicate externally, particularly when concerns are raised by or on behalf of their stakeholders. So business enterprises should communicate both adequate and easily accessible information to their stakeholders regularly. So both the information and the means of communication should be responsive to gender discrimination and the differentiated impacts experienced by women. So what's important to consider from a finance perspective is that in addition to being the right thing to do and having a positive impact on society, organizations should be considering the repercussions associated with violating human rights of employees, partners, and stakeholders. And of course, policy or legal risks and reputational risks are important business risks to be considered in relation to gender equality and social-related disclosures as well. So it's also important to note that the sustainable development depends on the equality of genders. So you might recognize this image here as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. So gender equality is on its own one of the 17 SDGs agreed to by UN member states, but of course it also contributes to many of the other SDGs as well. And the SDGs really represent an ambitious plan to attempt to end poverty, protect the planet, and improve the lives and well-being of all humanity. SDG 5 focuses specifically on gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. But aspects of gender equality are in the targets and associated indicators for 10 out of the 17 different Sustainable Development Goals. And if you'd like to see how gender equality links to the different SDGs, you can have a look at the annexes in the SSE guidance on gender equality for exchanges, which we'll share with you as well. So with that said, obviously we've established some of the importance behind this topic, but what exactly does improving gender equality do for society as well? Well, studies have actually shown that when we have more equality of genders in society, we see lower levels of violence, we see greater economic productivity, and increased resilience against financial and environmental crises. So I want to remind you that by gender equality, we don't want to imply that we need more women than men, but that equality means that both women and men are represented. They have the same level of power and are both heard and understood equally. However, to achieve equality, in many cases, we do need to provide extra support to the less represented gender, which, of course, in many cases today is women. So to give you an example of the extent of impact that gender equality currently has on society, a study by the World Bank estimates that loss in human capital wealth due to gender equality could be up to over 160 trillion US dollars. And another study has shown that equal participation of men and women entrepreneurs could boost global GDP by between 3 to 6%. So there'll be some links to read more about these in the slide handouts, which you can see on the screen there, and we'll share the link to access the slide handout with you in the chat throughout the session as well. So just to recap on some of the different benefits that we see from gender equality, of course, we've talked about the positive social environmental effects, but there are economic and business benefits as well. So we see that companies with higher levels of diversity, both in terms of gender and ethnicity, at executive levels are shown to have higher performance than their less diverse counterparts. And different genders have different attitudes towards risk as well. So what we actually see is that if our decision makers, for example, our board and leadership team, are gender diverse across our organizations, our functions, and our different work programs, this can lead to a more balanced decision-making process. Different genders, of course, experience the world differently as well, and they'll have different views and ideas that they can share from that perspective. Companies with workplace policies that support and promote gender equality also often find that they are better able to attract and retain talent. And as we'll talk about more in our session tomorrow, gender lens investing mandates globally are increasing as well. So that market has grown from 100 million US dollars in 2014 to now over 2.4 billion in 2018, for example. So that's just one period where we can see a lot of growth. And what we also see is that companies who have more diverse boards and senior management teams often demonstrate more positive overall environmental, social, and governance performance. This can include having more ethical business practices, enhancing their workplace policies, and also stronger community relations as well. So let's just look at one of the many studies on this topic to see a bit more detail about the benefits that diverse companies are seeing. So this data comes from a study by FP Analytics, which is an independent research and advisory division of foreign policy. And this study looks particularly at industries that are traditionally male-dominated and analyzes over 2,300 public listed companies around the world with more than 160 in-depth one-on-one interviews and follow-up surveys. And the study finds that companies with more women on their boards had on average a higher profit, greater transparency, and higher social performance ratings as well. So let's look at each of those three statistics. So on profitability, the study found that companies with a higher percentage of women in management were on average 47% more profitable than those with the lowest diversity in genders on their management. And these findings are consistent with other evidence as well, that promoting gender diversity can benefit a business's bottom line. In a study by the International Labour Organization, or ILO, women interviewed for the study detailed how they're leading their organizations on new revenue generating paths, advancing innovation in inertia-prone industries, and advocating for harm-reducing practices, and through that also continuing to build transparency and trust with their stakeholders. So in turn, that second point around transparency. So building trust around stakeholder groups, including employees, consumers, regulators, and investors, is vital for legacy industries that are working to evolve their business models, improve their regulatory compliance and performance, and respond to consumers' changing needs. And this study again found that companies with a higher percentage of women on their boards were more transparent in terms of their ESG disclosure. And in particular, companies with at least one woman on the board are actually 17% more transparent than those with no female board members. And finally, if we look at the CSR performance or social ratings of companies, this study also found there to be a positive correlation between gender diversity on boards and companies' overall social responsibility performance. Women interviewed for this study provided numerous first-hand accounts of their efforts to protect safety and labour rights, to integrate community development into their business strategy, and build local capacity and empowerment as well. So remember also that we discussed a few slides ago that diversity and equality can have important societal and environmental impacts. And another interesting aspect from this same study was that equality not only had an impact within the company, but also for the environment where it operates. So for example, more diverse boards were 39% more likely to reduce their emissions. They were 46% more water efficient, and they were 60% more energy efficient than their peers with less diverse boards. So in the slide handout, which you can access from the webpage we've shared with you, you'll find more detail on this study, and as well as a few more slides on some other studies that dive into this in a bit more detail. And we'll also share with you in the chat a recent publication that came out from the IFC on gender responsive climate governance and the role of women leaders as well. Great. So thanks everyone for staying with us so far. I'll just show you those slides there. But moving on, we'll be handing over now to Landon, who's going to take us through the next section on the landscape. So over to you, Landon.
Great. Thanks, Fiona, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for joining this important session. So now that we've had a look at the case for gender equality, let's narrow in a little bit more and have a look at the state of the market. So in the next section, we're going to home in on some key items, terms used when discussing gender equality. So with that, we're going to go back to our Menti. So hopefully you still have it open or a link handy, but if not, I'll reshare the Menti here, unless Fiona already has. Okay, thanks, Fiona. Okay, so we're going to test your knowledge a bit of the current state of the market and how much further we have to reach gender equality. So you can move the slider here to make a guess as to when we'll achieve gender equality globally on the current trajectory. So you can answer anywhere from 0 to 500, but just in increments of 10. So I'll give everyone a few moments to put in your best guess there. Few more seconds. Always encourage everyone to participate as much as possible here. Okay, well, I see answers slowing down. So some good guesses here, but unfortunately, it's still a very, very long time before we'll see gender equality on the current trajectory. So according to a report by UN Women, which we'll share in the chat, it will still be nearly 300 years or 286 to be specific before we achieve gender equality. The measurement does change based on how we measure equality. For example, the latest World Economic Forum, or WEF, Global Gender Gap Report indicated that it may take 130 years to achieve equality based on their calculations, maybe a bit more optimistic, but overall, we're not seeing really any indication that equality of people based on gender will be achieved, at least in our lifetimes. We'll pop over to the next Menti now. So what percent of CEOs of listed companies in Europe would you guess are women? So you may be familiar with an American study that went viral indicating that fewer large companies are run by women than by men, specifically named John. a sure indicator that the glass ceiling remains firmly in place in corporate America. So for chief executives of S&P 1500 firms, for each woman, there are 4 men named John, Robert, William, or James. But that was obviously for the US. So how do you think that varies with Europe? So what do you think is the percent of CEOs of listed companies that are women in Europe? Okay. Seeing a lot of guesses that appear maybe in the 0 to 30 or 0 to 30%-ish range. So I'll give it a few more seconds and then we'll get the answer. See someone guessing 2% in the chat. Okay. Okay, well, the answer is for Europe about 6% female CEOs. And this comes from data as well collected by the SSE through a very comprehensive report, and we'll share more information about that in a few minutes. The next Menti will ask what percent of board seats are held by women in Europe. So what do we think there for board seats? Okay, someone in the chat guessing 15%. Okay. 10%, another guess. Okay, I think here a lot of people guessing between 0 and 40% or so. Okay, we'll go to the answer now. So the answer is 36%. So about 36% of board seats are held by women in Europe. Okay, so we'll go back to the slides now. What it shows you that sometimes I think some folks were a bit optimistic, some were a little less glass half full. But no matter how you split the data, we go back to the fact that gender equality is quite a long ways off, including in the corporate boardrooms. So for those who might not have seen these publications before, we here at the SSE, in collaboration with IFC, UN Women, and other partners, have worked together to provide markets with an overview or a benchmark of current progress on gender and leadership of listed companies. And we'll dive into one of these reports to see a bit more how you did on the last Menti question. So here we have our 2023 report. So we'll share in the chat our 2024 report. But for now, that's it's all right to look at 23. It's not too different than 2024 actually. So this data can serve as a benchmark for exchanges and other relevant institutions in their efforts to promote women's full and effective participation in and equal opportunities for corporate leadership positions. So the first table we see on the screen shows the average percent of boardroom seats held by women in the G20 is about 22%, with an overall positive trend line. But still many countries are decreasing from the previous year. In case you can't quite see it, the top 5 exchanges in the G20 are located in France, the United Kingdom, Italy, Australia, and the USA. It's also worth noting, given that France leads the leaderboard for the G20, that they have a regulatory requirement for women on boards. So they require 40% of boards to be women. So however, even though that percent of women on boards is among the highest in the world, France's female executive leadership pipeline is not quite as strong. For this reason, in May 2021, the French Parliament voted to introduce gender quotas for executive leadership, so 30% minimum for either gender by 2027 and 40% by 2030. So here you can see with the green, many countries improving slightly each year. We do see some sliding backwards, and then we can see we still have a long distance to travel. For example, some data from this report shows that only 3 markets in the G20 have no all-male boards among their top 100 issuers, the TSX, Toronto Stock Exchange in Canada, ASX, Australia, and NYSE in the United States. And in 11 markets in the G20, more than 20% of the top issuers have male-only boards. But let's look beyond the G20 with some regional data on the next slide. So when we take a regional approach to the data on gender equality and corporate leadership, we find only 2 regions have an average over 30%, which is Europe and US CANs, which is US, Canada, and New Zealand, and Australia. So this is significant because it's been highly researched that at least 30% representation is required for a fair power distribution and for the less represented group to be heard, which we'll discuss a bit more in a few minutes. Europe leads with 30% or 36% of board seats held by women. This is significantly bolstered by France, which we just discussed, with 45% of board seats in Euronext Paris held by women. And then US CANs is not too far behind with 32%. Africa region averages about 22%, but there's a big degree of variance with South Africa at 32% and Egypt just 12%. Southeastern Asia is in 4th place with about 19%, Eastern Asia 14%, and the last 2 are Latin America with 12% and Western Asia with only 7%. So we'll dive a bit deeper into data, but as this study focused on the largest markets, unfortunately, we don't have the specific available figures for Greece currently, but it would be interesting to reflect on how you think your market may perform compared to the European averages. So, sorry, I'll just get the slides moving here. So you see the status in Europe. We have Euronext Paris, London Stock Exchange, Stockholm, Germany, and Switzerland. France is obviously at 45, and then it goes down to 28%. So feel free to make some comments in the chat, any reflections you have. If you think Greece would be in this range, or is Greece a little lower? Love to hear some of your thoughts. I see someone saying Greece is probably about 25%, so maybe a bit lower outside of this group. Magda noting that Greece is much lower. Yeah, so it seems from some comments, folks are saying Greece is probably a bit lower than what we see here on the screen, which is interesting. Now, I want to move into a topic that is always interesting to discuss. Oh, and thank you to Fotini, who notes 25% mandatory for listed companies. Yeah, it's something we've done reports on in the past as well, of mandatory minimums, soft or hard rules. Please keep your eyes open to SSE publications, as we'll have some more reports on that topic in the near future. And then I see Lita noting it'll be 33% in 2026. Sorry, just to answer someone's question really quick, Myrna, we do have some data for Middle East companies. Just last year, we did a report on Middle East and Central Asia. So you can find a lot of data on the Middle East if you go to our publication page on our website. So we'll be able to help you out if you're interested as well on the Middle East. So with that, let's discuss what you think might prevent a company in your region or beyond from advancing on these particular metrics. So if you could type in the chat, what do you think might be the barriers preventing progress to see more women in leadership positions? So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts. What are some barriers currently being faced? Corporate culture. Yeah, organizational or corporate culture is something we're going to discuss. Glass ceiling, gender bias, gender roles. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, family and working obligations. That's something we hear about and discuss a lot. So those stereotypes, which goes back to kind of these gender ideas on gender roles. Role models, that's a good one. That's something we'll discuss as well today, I believe today. And Mara notes that company culture is the main barrier from their point of view, since 25% is mandatory already. And then someone notes mentorship and allyship. Not enough support from the government, imposter syndrome. Okay, those are some great answers. So thank you so much for the participation. Um, some more good answers coming in. So thank you for that participation. And then we'll discuss a bit more some of these key barriers. So in addition to the structural obstacles faced by women in the general workforce, such as unequal regulatory environments, lack of workplace flexibility, and conflicts between work and family obligations, there are specific barriers that narrow women's leadership paths and can cause the drop in representation at the top. This is really where we dive into the complexities of this topic, so I highly recommend reviewing these on your own time as well. But in the meantime, let's go through a few that were not mentioned in the chat. Although, to be frank, I think everyone covered most of them. One I didn't see in the chat unless it was just added was limited availability of sex disaggregated data and inconsistent reporting practices. So that can make it difficult to measure progress or understand the extent of the gender gap. In turn, it can create challenges in identifying effective interventions to close the gaps. I don't think I saw lack of training and professional development opportunities, but that's an important one, particularly in areas with frontline operational or financial responsibilities. This can hinder women's attainment of qualifications. Another, I'm not sure, this came up a little bit in the chat, was lack of gender sensitive human capital management, including in hiring, retention, and promotion processes, such as a non-diverse hiring committee and limited use of gender blind applications, which can lead to decisions based on biases rather than on qualifications. Now, biases and stereotypes were definitely brought up in the chat. I won't go more into that for now. Lack of awareness or skepticism about the business case for gender balanced leadership. That can mean that initiatives to advance women may not be a top strategic priority for companies. Now, as allies, men in leadership who have embraced the values of diversity and inclusion can help to elevate the importance of such initiatives and drive action. I think one that was mentioned in the chat was limited access to networks and connections, as well lack of access to role models, mentors, coaches, and sponsors. So I think those two came up a bit. Those are definitely important. They can play an important role in boosting women's self-confidence, guiding their professional journeys, and championing their advancement. I think one that definitely came up was unsuitable work environments in traditionally male-dominated industries. This can make it more difficult for women to pursue long-term career paths. For example, there could not be women's locker rooms for changing out of uniforms or women's washrooms for managing menstruation with privacy. So while not specific to women in leadership, a lack of accommodation represents an overall deterrent to women entering a sector and progressing through the leadership ranks. And then I'm not sure if this one came up, but safety concerns in operational locations and gender-based violence and harassment. Acronym GBVH, in the workplace and domestic and sexual violence experienced beyond the workplace affects employees' well-being and business operations. Such experiences can lead to reduced productivity, increased absenteeism, and higher employee turnover. Can also deter women from pursuing promotions and career development opportunities that are those stepping stones to senior leadership. With that, it's important to note that achieving a truly gender diverse senior leadership team and optimizing the true value in diversity is about more than just sheer numbers and gaining parity and representation. The key is ensuring that men and women have equal voice and agency once they're in the leadership roles so that they can all contribute to determining their organization's path. So to increase the number of women leaders and prepare them to take on leadership roles, companies must truly invest in women. This means attending to the culture and purpose of their organizations, and it means adopting a more people-focused business model as part of an approach that integrates an ESG orientation into all aspects of operations. So, if you want to dive deeper into this topic, I also recommend reading a recent publication from the IFC on gender responsive climate governance. I think I may have shared that already, but if Fiona could reshare if possible. That report looks at why we aren't seeing the level we would like to see. In other words, what barriers are getting in the way. Some examples of what the report find are a lack of knowledge or training on the topic, a low level of climate and gender lens, and low understanding of the impact on business. So you see a few more reasons here on this slide, but for now we won't delve into all of them. And with that, I'll turn it back over to my colleague, Fiona, for the next section.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Landon. Super helpful. And just to say thanks everyone so far for all the great participation as well. We do love to hear your thoughts, so please do keep that coming. It's fantastic to see. So before we go into the break, we're going to go a bit more into the complexity of this topic and focus on some of the key terms used when discussing gender equality. So to start that off, I think some of you have spotted already that we have our next Menti question live, which is asking, what does gender equality mean to you? So Landon, if you could just reshare the link in the chat again, I will just make sure everyone has it. I will take us to the results so we can see those coming in. Okay, perfect. I see some responses here already. That's fantastic to see. So what does gender mean to you? So we have social classification, identity. I see the classification word coming up a few times, actually. Feel free to share in the chat as well, as I see someone has done, if you have any trouble accessing the Menti. So we have stereotypes, interesting. Parity, equality, two sides of the same coin, different ways of thinking. A social construction, interesting. Preferences, expectations, respect. We have some similar terms coming up, but I think it's quite fascinating. We're getting lots of different perspectives on this, and perhaps are we seeing gender as something positive, or are we seeing it as an area for difference and challenge, perhaps? So brilliant. Thank you, everyone. Lots of really interesting words. I guess we can see in the center there some of the common themes relating to identity, discrimination, equality. So yeah, that's interesting to land on. So let's revert now after this to seeing what gender is defined as in some common circles. So I'm going to just take us back now into the presentation. Just give me a second. I'll move to my other screen. Thank you, though, for sharing all of those thoughts, and please feel free to keep them coming in. You should be able to see those still in Menti. Great. So those were some great answers and lots of, I think, concepts within that will be captured in the definitions that we're going to use today. But we want to make sure that we're really on the same page with this and that we all have a common understanding of the depths of gender, which is not simply sex, being male or female. So the purpose of this initial exercise is to make sure that everyone understands that gender is not the same as sex and that gender can differ in different contexts and societies. And this is important because it's not really different sexes we always need when we speak about the value of diversity. It's actually different ways of thinking, different life experiences or lived experiences, and different institutional restrictions or freedoms. So whilst the term gender can be quite difficult to define because it means something different to different people, as perhaps we've seen with some of the definitions that we've shared with each other there, let's briefly get a better idea of what is included in this complex term. So UN Women define gender as the social attributes and opportunities associated with being male and female, and the relationship between women and men and girls and boys, as well as the relations between women and those between men. So these attributes, opportunities, and relationships are socially constructed and are learned through socialization processes. And they are context, time-specific, and changeable. Gender determines what is expected, allowed, and valued in a woman or man in a given context. In most societies, there are differences and inequalities between women and men in responsibilities assigned, activities undertaken, access to and control over resources, as well as other decision-making opportunities. So gender is part of the broader socio-cultural context. Other important criteria for social-cultural analysis can include class, race, poverty level, ethnicity, and age. So as such, gender really isn't as simple as male or female. Gender can be influenced and defined based on the nature of relationships, based on hierarchies, on history, on context, and on institutions or norms. And most importantly, when we're discussing gender equality today, please remember that we're referring to equality of the genders, not simply increasing women on boards. Although, of course, as we've talked about already, that is an important indicator to see progress. So feel free to explore this and other gender equality terms on the Gender Equality Glossary developed by UN Women that we include in the slide here. So to dive in a little bit deeper now, I'm sure some of you have seen or heard of the acronym of DEI, or Diversity, Equality and Inclusion. So we're increasingly seeing DEI managers or even teams in organizations that focus on ensuring an organization's DEI performance. So why not just diversity teams or just equity teams? Let's dig a bit deeper into how these concepts connect and interact, and the importance of having all three of these terms as the full equation. So let's start with equity. And this is around ensuring that there is an equitable power distribution among people. You can think of equity as providing women and men with the same microphone that amplifies their voices to the same extent so that everyone can hear them equally. Which you might be thinking, well, that is the objective, isn't it? Well, not quite. It's not just that part, but it's part of that overall picture. So let's say, for example, that our objective is equity or equal power distribution, but there are no women in the organisation to fairly distribute power to, or no one to pick up that microphone. So because of this, we then need to also focus on diversity. So diversity relates to ensuring representation. So the act of inviting the unrepresented gender to join the board enhances diversity of a board. So think of diversity as having enough seats at the table for diversity to be represented. And again, differences and different lived experiences are important to organisations. So it's not enough to have microphones at the table to make sure everyone can speak at the same volume. Also, enough chairs so that a diverse group of participants are at the table and willing to speak. But if we just have these two, however, we can still have cultural assimilation taking place, where, for example, women to have to act just like men, then we'll struggle to keep them on the board and we won't be benefiting from the diversity we aim to achieve. So it's no good to give someone a microphone if they're not willing to speak, or alternatively, to claim that by giving someone the power to speak based on their appearance alone is achieving diversity. So when the objective of diversity is to include diverse ways of thinking and diverse lived experiences, really. And so this is why we also have inclusion. And inclusion refers to behaviours and practices of making all members of an organisation feel welcomed, giving them equal opportunity to connect, to belong, and to grow, and to contribute to their organisation, advance their careers, and feel comfortable and confident being their authentic selves. So to bring it all together, we can say that diversity is being invited to the boardroom. Oh, excuse me. Diversity is being invited to the boardroom. Equity is having the empowerment to speak at the board meeting. And inclusion is being listened to within that board meeting. But of course, this goes much further than the boardroom, and that should be considered and applied organisation-wide as well. So the end goal here is then equality, which depends on all three of these circles: diversity, equity, and inclusion. We can have diversity without equity or inclusion, and it won't be sustained. Or equally, we can have equity without diversity, and we won't necessarily be making any progress there. So when we talk about equality today and in tomorrow's session, especially when we talk about the benefits that it brings, remember that we're not simply looking for an equal number of men and women on boards or in organisations. What we're really wanting here is these three things: diversity, equality, and inclusion. So you can find in your handout a more detailed version of this diagram. But now we're going to take a quick pause, maybe just to digest some of that, and also to have a quick stretch or a break to get something to drink if you'd like to, perhaps. So I'm going to start the timer here for a nice relaxing 5-minute countdown, and we'll restart again in 5 minutes when we're ready to. But should you have any questions or comments that you'd like to share, feel free to put those in the chat or Q&A box during the break as well. But we'll see you back here in 5. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona, for changing it. Didn't want to change the slide for me. But welcome back, everyone, from the break. Hopefully you had a chance to grab a tea or a cup of coffee and stretch your legs a little bit. So as mentioned in the chat, please feel free to use Q&A box or the chat box for any comments. So now, thanks to Fiona, that we have the initial concepts clear, let's dive into the content and start with how we can enhance an organization's performance on gender equality. So the objective of our next unit, Align, is to ensure that your practices align with the global best practices and standards, as well as any local or peer practices that should guide your efforts. So let's begin by looking at the global principles that companies can use to enhance their practices on this topic. So the global standards we're going to discuss today are the UN Women's Empowerment Principles, also known as WEPs. So before we go into the principles, we wanted to get a sense of your current familiarity with the the WEPs. So let us know, is your organization already a signatory of the WEPs? So if you know, please answer yes or no, or if you don't know, of course, put I don't know. If your organization is not yet a signatory, we'll also give you some information about how to become one at the end of this section. We'll give folks a few more seconds to answer. Okay, I'm going to end the poll there and share results. So as you see, about 15% know that yes, they are signed UN WEPs. About 30% or double that are no, and then a lot of folks don't know. So there is a way to find out as well that we'll mention and share the link to. But with that, today we're very lucky to have with us an expert on the UN WEPs. As she was introduced at the beginning, Maya is joining from UN Women and is here today to help provide an overview of the WEPs and to answer any of your questions about the WEPs. Now, before she gets started, if good with Maya, we can play a quick video that introduces the WEPs.
Think about the impact of a signature. Think about the magnitude of a global movement. Think about the difference you can make and the power of transformative change. By signing the Women's Empowerment Principles, you can galvanize your shareholders and stakeholders to drive change in the workplace, marketplace, and community through a framework of 7 principles. Brought to you by UN Women and UN Global Compact, the Women's Empowerment Principles are a roadmap for business sustainability, innovation, and productivity. Businesses by the thousands and in every sector are becoming part of this world-changing movement to advance gender equality. Businesses that become models for attracting talent, entering new markets, serving their communities, and measurably improving the bottom line. Because gender equality means better business. Don't miss this moment to make a lasting impact on your employees, suppliers, customers, and investors. Join leading companies already on the journey to greater sustainability and growth. Commit to the Women's Empowerment Principles and make today your organization's signature moment.
Okay, great. With that, I'll turn it over to Maya.
Thank you so much, Landon, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm Maya Löfström. I'm a program analyst at UN Women, and I'm so excited to be part of this training session to introduce you to the Women's Empowerment Principles, or WEPs as we call them. So as we saw before in the poll, I see some of you are signatories and some of you are not yet, and some of you are not entirely sure. So I hope that this session will be a helpful refresher or a learning opportunity for all of you. And with the rising importance of reporting and ESG, as mentioned earlier today, more companies are realizing the need to focus on gender equality. However, many are still unsure on how to turn that recognition into action. So that's where the WEPs come in. The WEPs really serve as a practical guide to integrating gender equality into business strategy, operations, and also impacting the workplace, marketplace, and community. And the WEPs offer a holistic framework that can help your company to advance gender equality while driving positive outcomes for both business and society. And they also provide a roadmap for achieving the Sustainable Development Goal number 5 on gender equality. And here on the map, you can see the global reach of the WEPs. We have currently over 10,000 companies in 190 countries. And these are all committed to the principles, demonstrating the widespread impact of the WEPs initiative. So now we have a little overview of the WEPs. Here are the 7 principles which the WEPs stand for, and I'll briefly walk you through them. So principle 1 focuses on the CEO and the leadership commitment. And it's not just about promoting women in leadership roles, but it's also about ensuring top executives are committed to making gender equality a core strategy. And then we have principles 2, 3, and 4, which are focused on the workplace. So principle 2 is about treating all employees fairly without discrimination. Principle 3 is about ensuring health, safety, and well-being at work. And principle 4 is about providing education and training for career growth. And it's important to think innovatively. And here is an example of that under principle 2. It's about a bank in Spain where they noticed that men were advancing more quickly because they worked very late, while women left early because they have family responsibilities. So to level the playing field, they introduced a policy at the bank to close the offices at 6 p.m. So this really helped to create an equal opportunities for career progression between men and women. And then we have principle number 5. It deals with the marketplace. So it's about encouraging companies to promote a diverse supply chain and gender responsive marketing. So at UN Women, we work with companies to adopt gender responsive procurement as a part of the sustainable supply chain. And principle 6 is about community engagement, urging companies to consult and engage with local women and girls to ensure their initiatives truly benefit them. And finally, principle 7 focuses on measuring and publicly reporting progress. So companies are encouraged to collect data and to track their gender equality efforts under principle 7. And then we have some examples of implementing the WEPs and the WEPs journey. So becoming a WEP signatory means embarking on a journey towards gender equality. It's not making everything happen at once, but it's taking one step at a time. So after signing up, companies are expected to engage internal stakeholders, to show public commitment, to work across value chains, and also to report on the progress. And it's really not about quick wins. It's about addressing systemic inequalities and then creating lasting change. So this slide shows the steps that companies take after joining, from activating internal stakeholders to sustaining the progress through regular data collection and also reporting. And it might sound like a bit of a difficult process, but it's not at all. At UN Women, we offer over 300 tools and resources to guide companies on how to work on the WEPs. And I'll speak more about that tomorrow. So how can you become a part of the WEPs network? Your company needs to be legally registered. We accept companies from all sectors, sizes, and ownership types. Stock exchanges are eligible. In fact, we have over 35 stock exchanges that already made a commitment to the WEPs. Continuing with the application process, you simply need to go to our website, weps.org, and fill out an online joining form and apply to become a WEP signatory. It's not too complicated, it doesn't take too long time, and it doesn't cost anything. So I really urge you to do that. And then speaking of stock exchanges, the WEPs team is a part of Ring the Bell for Gender Equality. Along with the UNSSC, IFC, World Federation of Exchanges, and UN Global Compact. So Ring the Bell is an event where stock exchanges ring the bell to raise awareness about gender equality around International Women's Day in March. So stay tuned for that and register if you are interested. We can give you more information on that as well. And that was all from my side for now. So thank you so much for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Maya. So that's a great introduction, and we recommend that all of those looking for a first step on this topic, that you start by working with leadership to become signatory of the WEPs. And for those that are already WEP signatories, which are more and more every day, we wanted to also flag what you can consider doing next. So this slide here highlights one of the options available, which is taking your commitment a step further by having your gender equality practices certified, and EDGE certifies with a service that can help you take your practices and provide a communication tool to show the market that you're a leading company on gender equality. With that, I'll turn it over to Fiona.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Maya and Landon, for that segment. And we'll be hearing more from a colleague at EDGE tomorrow, in fact, actually. So we'll find out a bit more about those standards with the speaker that we have joining us then. So that brings us into our next element on the local aspect of alignment. So one of the key factors that should be considered is, of course, where your company is listed, and as well as where your main operations are. So what regulations will apply to you in that area? So let's have a little bit of a discussion of what we're seeing here from a regulatory perspective. So on this slide, we can see a number of markets where there is some kind of gender quota or requirement set for listed companies from a past report that we produced at the SSE. So on the right, you can see the different status of gender diversity on the boards of companies in these markets, as well as the percentage of female board chairs and CEOs. One question we often get asked is whether or not quotas or mandatory minimums work, and if this should be implemented in a country. And I know we were talking earlier about what's in place for that in Greece as well. And so this is a hotly debated topic. And if you'd like to dig a bit deeper into it, you can review the extra slides that we've included in your handout today on this. And these provide some insights from a recent study featured by UN Principles for Responsible Investment about gender-based quota policies. But as we've seen in the data that we discussed today, sometimes this works and sometimes it doesn't. And why is that? Well, it's not entirely the reason, but a part of this is because it really depends on how the company implements these quotas. So what actions are taken by the company and how such a rule or regulation might be interpreted. So we're going to go down to the company level now to see what we mean by how a company implements it. And we're going to do a little exercise together. So to do this, we're going to discuss two hypothetical companies. So we're going to call one company Owl Inc. and the other company we're going to call Peacock PLC. So as you've probably guessed, these are entirely made-up companies, but the discussion we'll have is on their decision-making processes, and it's based on research on real companies. And so what we see is that both of these companies have currently got only 10% women on their boards and in executive leadership, but they have parity or around 50-50 split between gender at lower level positions. So it's clear that women aren't getting into the higher level positions. And they also have one other thing in common. They both just had a change in leadership and they have a new CEO join. So let's say that both CEOs are expecting a new regulation to come in. So they're preparing for a mandatory rule relating to gender equality. The new CEO at both companies is passionate about gender equality, and they want to achieve equality at the top of the companies in their board and leadership positions so that they can be included in a gender equality index, which will give them more exposure to investors that value gender parity. However, each company is taking quite a different approach towards their goals of gender equality and therefore had different results. So we're going to discuss their two approaches and what they do and see how that plays out differently for them. So first, let's start with Peacock PLC. So as we've said, they have a new CEO, and the approach that they're taking is to set a bold target of 40% women in leadership positions in 2 years. And to help reach this 40%, the CEO makes a big announcement to staff and shares her experience climbing the ladder. They use this example to encourage other women to follow her to the top too. They set a hiring freeze for any men until target is reached, unless approved by the CEO for her on her basis for extenuating circumstances. And some employers are feeling excited and empowered, but some are scared of more pressure, perhaps. So some women might feel more pressure to move up or out in the organisation. And some men potentially have job security concerns as well. So the overall sentiment in the organisation as a result of these initiatives could be seen to be a mix of some excitement, but also some fear. So let's have a look at what their competitor Owl Inc. does instead. So Owl Inc. again also has a new female CEO and is committed to gender equality in leadership positions. So instead of a 40% target and a hiring freeze, the CEO decides to join the 30% club. And if you're not familiar with this, the 30% club calls on its members to commit to at least 30% female representation on boards and executive leadership teams, because 30% is seen as the critical mass at which minority voices become heard. However, they want to surpass 30% and get to 40%, which is the upper target that they're aiming for. But the CEO isn't necessarily sure what the root cause of the issues are at the moment, and they're confused as to why some women aren't moving from operational level positions to leadership positions. So what she does is she sets up an internal task force to find out what these root causes may be in their organisation that are preventing women from climbing up. And at the same time, the CEO also initiates a reverse mentoring programme. So 50% of the workforce is already women, but why aren't leadership learning from them and hearing their experiences already? And this approach can allow leaders to really benefit from a more diverse perspective at their operational level, whilst also helping interested staff to progress in their careers. Okay, so that's explained a little bit to us about those two companies and the different approaches they're taking. So let's keep in mind some of the different strategies we've heard the two companies using there. And what we're going to do now is move to Menti to get your thoughts on which strategy you think will be best overall. So I will just reshare the screen in Menti and make sure you've got that open in front of you again with the link that we've shared. And we'll see what you think. Great. So what we'd like you to do is to have a think and rank those different activities that we heard about there in terms of what you think will be the most effective to the least effective. So number 1 being the most effective activity that they could do, and number 6 being the least effective. So take a moment and think through how you would rank those different activities in terms of their effectiveness. So I know there's a couple of things to think about there. We've got plenty of time for this, so I'll give you a moment to all have a think and give us your responses on that. Of course, if you have any thoughts you'd like to share about the rationale for what you've picked, feel free to share that in the chat as well. It's always useful to know your thinking. Okay, I see we have about 20 people who've responded so far. So I know there's plenty of us in the session today, so I'll give you all a little bit longer to have a think of that through. Okay. Still see a few more of you are responding, so I'll give us perhaps another 20 seconds or so before we start having a talk through those options. And if you are having any trouble accessing Menti at all, feel free to share with us in the chat which activity you think perhaps would be the most effective, or which you think might be the least as well, perhaps. Any thoughts you might have on why that would be? Okay, great. So we've had about 60-something participants. So I think let's start having a talk about what we see, but feel free to keep voting in the background. Okay, so we're seeing here that creating a gender equality task force is coming out as our top activity. And of course, this is a really good starting point. We then see the sharing examples of role models at the top as another practice coming through, perhaps the second best, but second after the task force. So of course, this is really good as well. We often see that since women may not have effective role models to look up to, that actually making sure that we're really highlighting and showcasing the journeys and the practical experiences of those women who've made it into leadership positions can be very motivational and informative as well to others in the organization, and really help to create a cultural change. And just to touch again on the gender task force point, of course, as we highlighted in the example from Owlink, unless you really understand what the reasons and the barriers are that are specific to your organization, you're unlikely to be able to put in place the right measures to change things. So really taking that time to understand what's going on at present, and how that might be affecting women's advancement in the organization will be a really valuable investment of time. So we had the two kind of activities relating to target setting that the different companies had taken. So number 3 here you've ranked is the setting the 40% target, whereas perhaps you've ranked that joining the 30% club you think might be slightly less effective. And this is a really interesting question, I think. So what we have to remember is that 40% is a top target, while 30% is a bottom target that they say they want to surpass. So to some extent, it can depend on the culture of your organization, of course, as to which you think will be most effective. Do you want to go more ambitious to begin with and push for that bigger goal? Or maybe do you want to set out incremental steps along the way? And I think to some extent, it can depend on what type of organization you are as to which target will be most effective there. And most of you have also ranked the reverse mentoring scheme as a fairly effective measure. Of course, I think that connects to some of the points we've mentioned above already that would apply for the task force and the role models. So, a reverse mentoring program, the feedback that you gain from that in terms of what some of those barriers may be will be very insightful to understand, and could be something that you feed back to your task force, for example. And in turn, having that direct connection between more junior women and perhaps those in senior leadership positions will really help to show those examples of how people can perhaps balance some of the challenges we discussed earlier in the course. And then most of you have tended to rank that the hiring freeze of the overrepresented gender, in the case of these company case studies being men, as perhaps a slightly less effective measure. And again, we would probably say that we'd agree with this. This can be somewhat of a demotivating thing if it's not used properly. Of course, we see that in an organization that takes this approach, they may not be thinking about the whole picture of what's going on here, and it might overlook some of the nuances to how this should be approached. So a few other points that maybe we would note here is that, of course, we need to know why women aren't being promoted and what the root causes are. And that's something that's really important to take in mind. So, I think we've covered off a lot of the points here. But I think we very much agree with how you guys have ranked this actually. And so really, I think one of the things we wanted to land on here is coming back to that diversity, equity and inclusion equation earlier, and how that feeds into equity. So really thinking about the levers that are going to help you to address those different aspects of power dynamics, but also around sharing that power, giving access to it, and really identifying what root causes there may be to blocking progress on those different areas. Great, so thanks very much for everyone sharing their thoughts on that. So let's go back to our slide presentation now, and we'll have a look at how things play out in our hypothetical case study for those two companies, which I think perhaps based on your responses, you may agree perhaps with what our predictions would be for that. So starting with Peacock PLC, who were the organisation that prioritised targets and set that higher, more aggressive target and had the hiring freeze. So what we saw was they had some immediate progress after setting that quota, but ultimately they didn't identify those underlying issues that were the root cause. And so these meant that they hadn't had much success in promoting women, and they actually demotivated some of the men in their organisation who felt that they were less secure in their jobs and they had less opportunity to grow. But what they also didn't realise is that there were other issues present since they hadn't examined those root causes. So even with the efforts to address those particular issues they tackled, there were still many barriers. So for example, the working culture needed some changes. The benefits packages they had perhaps not very equal in their approach. There were pay gaps, unconscious biases, etc. And so filling positions when they were not hiring men often took them longer. And sometimes ultimately the people hired were not the right candidate. External hiring to fill the positions meant that their efforts weren't really working. So, that actually can sometimes be detrimental to the cause of more equality if the wrong people are hired into the wrong positions for those reasons. And the result we really saw from this is that although there was some progress in terms of the absolute numbers, the culture change wasn't positive within the organisation. There was a higher rate of turnover, and ultimately that meant that there was less innovation in how to approach this topic. So although we can say that the CEO, of course, had great intentions with that ambitious target that they set and the quite strict barriers that they implemented, they weren't ultimately aware of those root causes, and so they couldn't effectively address the issue. So you may be guessing where we're going here, but let's have a look at how we think that could have played out within Owl Inc., who really prioritized addressing those root causes. So they had similar ambitions and intentions, but they went about it quite differently. So it's important to note that it's likely that Owl Inc. would have had to invest more money and time up front to deliver this approach. But very soon we'd expect that they would see a return on that investment. Whereas we can see that for Peacock PLC, they were actually having to pay more in the long run for not making that investment up front. So Owl Inc. took a much more holistic approach, and they realised that if they wanted to benefit from the changes in their organisation's leadership, they needed to manage these issues better. So this would have to not only be accepted by the organisation as a whole, but also they would need to tackle those specific issues within the organisation that were causing their lack of diversity. So by creating a task force, as well as implementing a reverse mentoring programme, they were able to identify not only the specific barriers that came to cause issues, so for example, inflexible working arrangements, biased benefits, or a lack of support for certain genders to be able to succeed, but they were also able to change their culture as well. Their mentorship program opened the eyes of their leadership team to the value of diversity in decision-making processes. And as a result, the company saw increased innovation, since diversity leads to more pushbacks of ideas. Since diversity leads to more pushback and more interesting ideas, but it also pushed leaders to think of new and innovative solutions. And since they ended up actually saving some of those resources associated with external hires because of their better retention rate, they could actually also focus more on training and educating their staff to continue to enhance their corporate culture and ultimately achieve what they were looking for. So here we've really seen that in this example, regulation doesn't depend only on a quota, but it's really around that organizational culture and the potential deeper issues that might be at play. And in that example there, we saw that actually by taking a closer look at some of those issues and prioritizing getting to the root cause, Owl Inc. were ultimately more successful in the long run. So on that note, we don't have enough time to go into this in a lot of detail today, but we recommend before the next session that we review a bit of the detail on this. So this is a useful slide that gives you a list of actions that you could take to make sure you're identifying the root causes and not making the same mistakes as Owl Inc. might be. So we can maybe cover a few of them now, but ultimately looking at those recruitment practices, as we've mentioned, and thinking about a more nuanced approach to recruitment, thinking about gender sensitivity and unconscious bias training, about how you post your job postings, and perhaps blacking out identities within your process so that people are hired just, on the basis of their experience and skills. But also there's aspects to look at relating to policies, audits, and, setting that leadership tone from the top as well. All right, so thinking about all of those factors, we're going to wrap up this section with another Zoom poll before we move on to some more content from Maya. So this final poll, which I will just launch for you now, relates to improving your financial performance. So we touched on there in those case studies how we think that this might play out differently. So how can your company improve its financial performance? So think about which of these answers would be best to improve financial performance for gender equality. So I'll give you a moment just to put in your responses. And of course, as we note here, you can select more than one choice if you think there's more than one correct answer. So feel free to pick as many of these as you think would be correct. Okay. Just give it a few more seconds, get a couple more responses in, and then we'll have a talk through the results. Okay. A couple more responses. I'll give you 5 more seconds and then we'll close the poll. Great, let's share those results. Okay, so it seems like the majority of you went for options 1, 3, and 5, which are indeed our correct answers here. So emphasizing really that there's an importance of having all 3 of these factors, not just one of them. So, for example, with having just gender-based targets but no policies to ensure that women are supported, then the data won't be collected to better understand why less women apply for positions. And then you're going to be missing out on the root cause of the problem. And will, ultimately struggle to reach equality. Yeah. As we've said before, without equity, we won't have equality. So, we recommend looking at this data side of things, setting those policies and setting targets. But of course, as we talked about in some of those case studies there, setting, binary targets of having only women or only promoting women often will have adverse effects and may ultimately be, less effective towards achieving that goal in the long run. Okay, great. Thanks everyone for sharing your thoughts with us on that one. So that brings us to the end of this section. And so now we're going to be moving on to talk a bit about peer practices. So we're going to focus on the level of companies and look at some peer practices here. So to kick us off on this, I'm going to hand back to Maya, who's going to share a bit more detail here. Thanks, Maya.
Thank you so much, Fiona. So here are some examples of implementing the WEPs from signatories who have decided to work on the workplace issues. One of them being a management company in South Africa who implemented a strategy to increase women's representation to 40% across all senior levels of the organization. So this is what Fiona was touching upon before. But to achieve this, they launched a women's leadership development program to enhance the recruitment of women. With this, they also set a clear goal and an action plan, and the company exceeded its target, reaching almost 50% of women in senior level positions by having these plans in place and making sure that it was communicated throughout the entire company. Another example is from a bank in Sweden who tackled the gender pay gap for its nearly 16,000 employees in 4 different countries. It operates in Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Sweden, and they put in place a job evaluation system and they kept updating it regularly. So this was really critical to understanding what makes roles comparable to others and how equal pay can also be measured. And they also followed up with closely monitoring and reporting of the program and produce reports on a regular basis. So this is really important in terms of keeping the initiative sustainable as well. So we have some really great tools for you to access, like the Gender Action Plan module, which we will dive deeper into in tomorrow's session, the Gender Responsive Recruitment Checklist, and also the Gender Responsive Procurement tool. And these are only some of our tools and resources. We have over 300 currently, so it might sound a bit daunting, a bit difficult, but it really isn't. We're also here to support you, and you have so much guidance through the webs.org website as well. And becoming a web signatory is about much more than just signing up. It's about making a real lasting commitment to gender equality in your business practices and to contribute to a more inclusive economy as well. And whether that is through leadership development, equal pay, or supporting women entrepreneurs, the WEPs can provide a clear path for driving progress and creating meaningful change. So we invite you to join this global initiative towards gender equality. And I thank you very much for your time. And I look forward to seeing the impact your companies will make in the future. And I also look forward to seeing you tomorrow again. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Maya. That's fantastic. And if I could also flag, we've had a great question in the Q&A from Eleni on corporate culture. It'd be great to get your thoughts on that question, if perhaps you could come back to her on that. Brill, thank you. Great. So that moves us to our second guest segment in this session. So as I mentioned, unfortunately, Harry wasn't able to join us today. He does very much send his apologies, but I have a recording of Harry's presentation that I'm going to share with you. One thing to flag is there will be a poll towards the end of Harry's segment. So what I will do is I'll pause the video to run the poll live in today's session so that you can all give us your thoughts on it. And I can discuss those results. But we'll hear Harry talking on the recording about the correct answer as well. So just bear in mind that when Harry's talking, he'll be mentioning a different poll that was conducted, but we'll see whether you agree with the participants from that session. So I will play this segment now, and it's all around gender indices and kind of really diving into how Bloomberg kind of work with data on a financial market basis to understand the impacts of gender equality on different companies. So I'll hit play.
Hi, Fiona. Thank you. Thanks for that, and good to meet everyone. I'm just going to take over the screen share if you give me 1 second. There we go. Hopefully everyone can see that full screen now.
Yeah, that's great.
Great. Okay, thanks. So yeah, I am Harry. I work for Bloomberg on our new gender equality score, formerly known as our gender equality index product, for 3 years now. So I'm a senior data analyst, basically reviewing, collecting, and analyzing all different types of gender data. So I'm going to take you through around 15-minute session on the history of our product, how Bloomberg looks at gender and how we score it, and then a training exercise to put all of that into something a bit more practical and real world examples of how this sort of data can be used and analyzed. So for some background, as I said, we've had a bit of a overhaul of how Bloomberg looks at gender data. So previously we used to run a questionnaire. That started off as an invite-only questionnaire of 23 companies based in America only, also only in the financial section. So it's basically 23 US banks voluntarily submitting data through a questionnaire. We expanded that questionnaire and it got up to around about 650 participants a few years ago, before we realized that we wanted to do something a bit more wide and capture more gender data on more companies. With that, we moved away from this survey and we started capturing data on publicly disclosed companies such as yourselves all around the world. So our new score is based on a pilot universe of just over 3,000 companies. It's about 3,200, and we'll be expanding that to all 15,000 companies that Bloomberg tracks for ESG data by the end of next year. So any company that Bloomberg tracks, as I said, there's over 15, I think there might be nearly 16,000 now, we'll also be scoring them on gender. As part of that, we carried out this open engagement process. So we had all of our survey questions, we had companies that had participated in our survey and hadn't participated in our survey. We talked to them about the sorts of KPIs that we're looking to measure and score. Did they feel they're realistic to measure internally and then make available externally for us to capture? And reviewed all of those sorts of things as part of formulating our new score. And the thing is that it's new. You know, the scores for financial year 2022 went live about a month ago. And financial year 2023 will be out in the new year, and from then on we'll be scoring kind of as and when data is published. It's a new score. It doesn't have a load of corporate awareness, especially at the moment. So there's a real opportunity for anyone who engages early and discloses data early to really get ahead of the curve. Like, there's a decent amount of score that goes to just disclosing this data, because as everyone knows, sometimes gender data can be a little bit sensitive to want to disclose and can be a little bit difficult to measure. So yeah, there is definitely an opportunity for anyone who does that early to you know, be scoring well. Given all of that history, as I said, I want the bulk of this to be a case study and something to get you thinking. So we're going to take two companies. So we've got Louis Vuitton, which is a high-profile luxury fashion brand, and we have Under Armour, which is a popular sportswear brand. We have these two companies. From now on, they'll be known as Company A and Company B, and by the end of this, I will ask you to basically guess who you think is who. Just take a moment to think about the sort of high-level social biases you may have when you're thinking about these companies. So a fashion company, you know, probably something where more women might want to work, might be more engaged. Under Armour, you know, maybe something that's a bit more mixed, or maybe have a few more men involved. And what benefits they might want to offer to their employees. You know, if Louis Vuitton has a lot of women there, maybe they are used to it and offer more benefits, all of those sorts of things. So we'll take a look at the actual data reported by, you know, these now two mystery companies, and look at how data can drive decision making. So firstly, my role working on this gender data and these gender equality scores is actually within Bloomberg's ESG department, or sustainability department. One question that I get a lot is, where does gender sit within ESG? How does gender relate to ESG? The answer is that it's kind of in a bit of both. You know, we've got social metrics that we look at, we've got governance metrics that we look at. That's why we've decided to produce this kind of standalone gender equality score. So it's not going to be a subsection of social, it's not a subsection of governance, it's its own standalone thing. So please just take a note of the social and governance scores so that we can look at how they relate to the gender score at the end as well. The social score for Company A is a bit higher, and the governance score for Company B is a bit higher. That's kind of the main thing to note here. Again, just looking at some of the themes of gender that might be involved in these social and governance metrics. So in social, we have the social supply chain management, and in governance, we have the board composition. So the gender diversity really is something that we look at in the governance score. But as you're about to see, there's so much more to it than just these sub-issues. So again, just make a note, the social supply chain management and the social score of Company A is a bit higher, but the gender diversity, I think, is a bit higher. I think my screen share bar is hiding the G score, but the G score of Company B is slightly higher. So now we'll look at some of the metrics that we measure exclusively in our gender equality score. So you'll see on the left, Company A, and Company B on the right. So this is all data taken from our survey the last year that we ran it. But all of these metrics will be carried forward into the new public score. So please, you know, bear that in mind when you're reviewing. Company A has more women on the board, and you know, in general, more women throughout all different levels of the business, with the exception of executives. So you can see that in general, Company A has more women, it has more new hires, you know, more workforce. This is the section that we call the talent pipeline. So talent pipeline and senior leadership, Company A is slightly ahead of Company B. What you'll notice is as we look at these, Company B doesn't disclose everything. So the % women of total promotions, that's a field where we look at of everyone who received a promotion or an upwards move in the company, what % of those were women? Percent women new hires is of all of the people that joined the company, what % of those are women? And women attrition is of all of the people that left the company, what % of those are women? See that company B doesn't seem to track that and has a slightly lower sort of pipeline %, but it's not, miles behind, it's not miles off. Then you look at company A, all of these benefits that we ask for, with the exception of the flexible work, is not disclosed by company A. So this is a pillar that we call inclusive culture. So this is making sure that the workplace is supportive and is an environment where it enables women especially to thrive. So we look at parental leave. Parental leave retention rate is a field where we are measuring all of the people who remained employed by the company after coming back from parental leave. So the purpose of this one is really to assess the culture around taking parental leave. Sometimes we see, a really high parental leave benefit in terms of weeks, but then a really low parental leave retention rate, which could indicate that there's a bit of a negative culture or stereotype associated with taking parental leave. Flexible work benefit can be flexible location, flexible schedule, anything like that. And then we have backup family care benefits. So that can include social care for children. It can also include elderly care as well. Both of those are in there. So again, just kind of make a note, company A slightly ahead on the pipeline. Company B is disclosing benefits that company A aren't. And as I said, there's a decent amount of credit as well given in our score to just disclosing metrics, even if it's a no, even if it's viewed as an unfavorable figure. There's a decent amount of score there. So now I will ask Fiona or Landon to run a poll for me. Which company do you think is company?
Sorry, everyone, I just realized it paused. I thought that was Harry actually pausing for the poll, but that pauses the video when I run the poll. So I'll give you all one more second to put your answers in. I see lots of you have participated already, and then we can return to the video to hear Harry's results. Thanks for bearing with us. Okay, let's end the poll there and I'll share the results and then we'll dive back into the presentation. I think this is, quite similar to what Harry will say, but so it's about 57% of you have guessed that company A is LVMH or Louis Vuitton in the fashion industry, and about 43% of you have guessed Under Armour in the sports sector. So I'll stop sharing that and we'll play the video again so we can see what the result is.
A. Give everyone a couple of minutes to vote. Going back, yeah, about this Under Armour. So I can reveal.
Sorry, everyone. Let me get this right. That was me attempting to skip to the right part and skipping too far. We'll give it a few seconds.
Slight majority think that company A is Louis Vuitton. Slight minority think that company A is Under Armour. So I can reveal that company A is in fact, there we go, Louis Vuitton. So yeah, thanks very much for listening to that short exercise. The whole purpose is just to get you start to think about the sort of data that Bloomberg as a collector and someone that runs scores are interested in, and also that our clients are invested in. Like our clients that are using this score can be corporates who just want to benchmark themselves against each other. They can also be investors who are looking to use this as a signal. So that is the kind of thing that the market is now moving to disclose towards. As I said, we're scoring over 3,000, expanding to 15,000 later on. And if you are ready to take the next step and start disclosing these metrics, we're also here to help. So we want this to be like an opportunity to engage with us. I'll drop my contact information in the Zoom chat. You can also reach me on LinkedIn. I'll drop email addresses and everything. And if you Google, ESG Bloomberg or Gender Equality Bloomberg, there'll be a website where you can find a contact form as well. So thanks very much, and thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone for listening to that, and thanks for bearing with me on the technology. Let me just exit the video so we can move to the next slide. There we go. So yeah, hopefully that was an interesting segment from Harry. As I said, he sends his apologies, he can't be here in person, but I think a really interesting example to show how, the financial analysis community is really actually seeking to understand this data now and to factor it into their understanding of corporate performance, not just within the realm of ESG scores, but actually into their overall assessment of companies in terms of their outlook and resilience. So yeah, I think that's a super interesting example. And I know Harry would be happy to hear from you if you do want to reach out to him to know more about that. But as we can see on the screen, and Landon has just shared in the chat, we're now coming up to the end of our first session today. So we're just going to take a quick look back in Menti again to wrap up on the session. So it'd be great if you could just have a reflect from today and let us know what's your immediate takeaway from today? What do you think you plan to take forward? Appreciate there's been a lot of different topics and aspects that we've covered, and not always possible to take on board everything that we hear in a training session, but it can be really helpful just to reflect perhaps on our key activity or action that we'll take. So thanks everyone who's already shared your responses there. So we see a number of good ideas here around setting a target for gender representation, offering training to employees, perhaps considering mandatory minimum representation percentages, looking at your recruitment policies, looking at a mentorship and development program, looking at setting goals and measurement, maybe having a task force, as we talked about in the case studies, or a mentoring scheme. And then we have raising awareness and persuading top management to support interventions and targets. Yes, exactly, getting your leadership on board. We had lots of more examples here. So joining the WEPs, exactly. So signing up to the WEP principles is super useful as a starting point to help build that framework out, as Maya talked us through. And we'll talk a bit more about that tomorrow as well. Lots of great ideas here. So thanks for sharing those action points. We really do encourage you to do what you can to take that next step in your organization, even if it's only a small one. We know that can be super helpful just to have a tangible takeaway. So fantastic to see so many reflections on that front already. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so I have one more Menti question for you before we just cover a couple of more housekeeping points to end the session. So we want to just sense with those learning areas that we talked about at the start of today's session, we might have hopefully moved you on a little bit in terms of your comfort and understanding on those topics. So your knowledge of different issues on gender equality, your comfort in discussing that with others, and how likely you are to take action. So just take a moment and let us know. Hopefully you feel a little bit more confident on these topics. I know we had, some good performance on that already, but I think it looks like particularly on the first element there around your knowledge of gender equality, I see a good improvement there. So that's fantastic, and yeah, great to see good confidence in all of those areas. Excellent. Okay, so thanks everyone for sharing again. I'll leave that open in the background as well if you want to share any more, but I'll just take us back to a couple more slides before we close off today's session. Slight delay in the slides there. Just take it back one. There we go. Yes, it's just to mention, we know that there's a lot of learning involved and time. We really appreciate the time that you guys are taking to join us. So it's just to say that if you participate in the 2 sessions that we're organising this week, you will be able to receive a certificate of participation. This course is CPD certified, which means that you can count it towards a professional body membership. For example, if you're a chartered accountant and you need to have CPD hours or credits. So obviously hope that is a good reward or incentive for joining us for this time, which we know is a lot out of your day, but we so appreciate everything that's already been shared in the session, and we really hope you'll be able to join us tomorrow as well. And as we mentioned, tomorrow we're going to be diving into the 2 second modules, which is all around how you really implement this and how you communicate this information to your stakeholders internally and externally as well. So we hope you'll find that helpful. And tomorrow we have Maya joining us again from UN Women, and we also have some guest speakers from Luxembourg Stock Exchange to speak about gender bonds, and also the organisation Edge about their certification that we spoke of earlier. So with that, we'd just like to say a final thank you to all of our speakers today. Thank you to Maya for joining us. Thank you to Harry, of course, for his presentation from Bloomberg. And of course, a big thank you to all of the SSE supporters who make this programme possible. But first and foremost, we want to thank the Athens Group for hosting today's session, for Lillian and Alexandros and their team for bringing us all together. And of course, all of you for your fantastic participation and engagement in today's session. Again, just a final thank you to all of those contributors and supporters of this programme. So enjoy the rest of today, everyone. We hope you've had a fantastic time at the training session. Feel free to share any comments or questions in the chat as we close out. But otherwise, have a great rest of your day, and we'll look forward to seeing you all again tomorrow. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye.